library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thanks for coming out, everybody. Lovely to see all of you. Kaya, let's start with something we often end interviews with, because I think it's a good place to set the stage. You mentioned a little bit in the book things that people get wrong, especially people in the West, us, get wrong about Turkey. I think we should start there. What do you think are the misconceptions about how we understand modern Turkey and the political structure that sort of governs it right now?
Well, I think Turkey is seen in terms of a country divided between secularists and Islamists, and the secularists are the good guys and the Islamists are the bad guys. And I don't think that's true, because I think they're both bad guys, to be honest. I mean, that's my experience. I grew up not liking the secularists because they were running the country in the 1990s when I was in high school. And then the Islamists came and they said, we're going to reform the system. We're going to make Turkey a European country, they claimed. And then they turned out to be much worse than the secularists. So I try to understand what makes both these camps so bad. You know, what drives them politically, what gives them this final shape that makes them Turkish politicians, because they're kind of role-playing something very similar, like maybe even a socialist may end up playing that role, or an anarchist even may end up playing that role, because there's this political system in Turkey that is very much male-oriented and very much power-oriented and very centralized. And it's a very masculine culture, and it is based on hypocrisy, lies, and it's based on role-playing. And Atatürk, I'm sure you know, is the founder of modern Turkey. He was an Ottoman soldier, and after the First World War, he led the resistance movement, and he became the first president of the secular republic. And you'll see his sculptures everywhere in Turkey. You'll see his portraits everywhere in Turkey. And he's a kind of the national icon, the kind of model that everyone wants to be. But at the same time, everyone can model him the way that they want him to be. So, for example, for Erdogan, people like Turkish President Erdogan, Atatürk was a pious Muslim. You know, he loved Islam, and he was actually a commander in the army of the Caliph during Ottoman times. But for others, Atatürk was an enlightenment figure. You know, he loved Diderot, he loved the French language, he loved alcohol. You know, he died from drinking too much. I mean, technically. And so there are some communists who believe Atatürk was leading a kind of anti-imperialist war. So there are all kinds of people who are trying to use the image of this man who is very strong and handsome for their own political gain. And I think that's what I don't like about Turkey. And that's like a man kind of embodies it. And that man can be representing anything you like, as long as you're convincing in how you transform him.
I think it's fair to say there's a tension that goes throughout the book between the concepts that people have about Turkey, especially Turks themselves, And it's right there in the title of your book. There's the lions and then there's the nightingales. And sometimes figures can be both at once, and sometimes there's a fight about which ones they truly are. So tell me a little bit about these two archetypes that sort of dominate how you describe modern Turkey.
Yeah, so the title actually came from the book editor, as it happens in these things. My book's editor had a partner who was a curator in the British Pavilion in Venice. And so my editor was in Venice during the preparations for the biennial, and he noticed all these statues of lions in the city. And I don't know if you've been to Istanbul, but it's a city very similar to Venice. You know, there's the water, there are houses on the water, and these two cities have lots of historical, cultural similarities, connections. And he said, you know, these lions, they represent power, the kind of powerful figures of Venice, the power of Venice. And your book is filled with these characters who are kind of nightingales, because they are always interested in the arts, and they're kind of an opposite of this power structure. And I lived in Cihangir for many years. It's an artistic hub of Istanbul, a kind of bohemian neighborhood where lots of the artists reside. And in my book, I tell lots of stories from this neighborhood. And increasingly, I saw that people around me were getting arrested, were getting into trouble. And I was in Italy when I was writing this book, and I was feeling very guilty for being in Italy, for talking to my editor about Venice and the lions and the waters of Istanbul, everything, because all the people that I grew up admiring, they were ending up behind bars. And I remember this Turkish novelist called Ahmet Altan. You should read his novels, he's great. And he was having his court case hearing when I was in Florence, and just looking at the news of his hearing, and he's a kind of Emile Zola figure, you know. He's talking about injustice, about oppression, and I noticed that, you know, this is a novelist. This is a very self-confident, brave novelist, and he's in jail. And he ended up being imprisoned for life. And I'm writing this book, and I was trying to imagine what will happen to me. You know, when will this book come out? Because it's a British book, it will come out perhaps years later, as it does. So it came out 2 years later. But I couldn't guess what Turkey would be like 2 years later, where I would be 2 years later. And I felt very vulnerable and fragile, and I noticed that this was a quality that I was sharing with lots of the artistic community in Turkey, who are economically very precarious because they were losing most of the funding that they had for their arts, for their books, because you know, Erdogan was honestly waging a war against all kinds of progressive business people, or like people who were paying for arts and culture. And so this fragility, this vulnerability, this precarity became a kind of commonality for my book, around which I connected all these figures. And it continues to be the case. You know, these Nightingale figures, many of them left the country for various reasons. And still, I was in Cihangir a few weeks ago, and I was looking at the streets, and I noticed that most of the people I knew no longer lived there. And so I think this book can be like a document of maybe the last lively years of these people who lived on those streets and cities of Turkey, because afterwards it really became very hard.
So talk to me about some of those people, because this is a book about the political reality of modern Turkey, but we hear from very few politicians in it, right? We hear from a lot of average people, filmmakers, journalists, a cleaning woman. We hear from you a fair bit, and we hear a lot more of that tension, right? A desire for security, which your President Erdogan offers, but also a desire for freedom, a desire for religious liberty, but also in some cases a sort of begrudging love of this secular idea of Turkey. So talk to me about the people who sort of make up this book and what they represented and the story you were trying to kind of get across from this cross-section of Turkish society.
Yeah, so for me, one of the inspirations were the Soviet dissidents, for example, who people like Solzhenitsyn, and because I was seeing lots of similarities between how Erdogan ran Turkey and how Stalin ran Russia, and the kind of reaction to it was very Russia-like. And so this journalist that I profile in the book, it's a prison journal. He was my editor when I was doing journalism. This wonderful guy called Murat Çelikkan, and I grew up reading his columns. He's a kind of figure of, let's say, someone like David Remnick or someone who is always there, and you hear his voice, and very lively and also powerful because he's very successful. And then one day he ended up in prison, and before that there was a kind of farewell party to him, or not farewell, but like goodbye party the day before he went to the prison house, and I asked him to kind of keep a journal of one day in a Turkish prison, and he, because he's a very nice guy, he said okay, and he told me how much he learned in prison, because he was staying with Kurdish inmates, and he was imprisoned because of this. So there's a Kurdish newspaper, and on the masthead, editor, contributing editors, this and that, and some intellectuals put their names on the list of contributing editors to support the newspaper. And the government said, we're going to arrest everyone who is on the masthead. And so he ended up getting arrested. So that was his crime. So what did he do in prison? He decided to learn Kurdish because he didn't speak Kurdish. And in return, because he was the only Turkish-speaking guy in his cell, he taught them English. And he taught Agatha Christie novels, he said, because the Kurdish inmates loved Agatha Christie. And he loved Kurdish novels in return. And so he was telling me all about his methods and how they behaved, like very small things, like what they did when the guardians came into the cell, and what they did when they left. So for me, this is maybe material even for a novel. So great detail, texture, and how do you get that detail and texture? I think it's about a kind of trust, because in Turkey you become paranoid, because if you're an intellectual, if you're progressive, if you have a certain kind of politics, you fear you can get a knock on the door. So you don't trust people around you, you start losing trust. So for this book, trust was vital, like, because who knows what I'll do with the material that they give me. So this was one of the stories in the book. And I also wanted someone who is embodying the whole regime in the book. And I found a kind of speechwriter for Erdogan, a young guy, and he was interested. We had talks, I interviewed him, we had lots of correspondence. And then one day I was asking him about some personal detail, and he just freaked out. And he had kind of like, almost like a panic attack, and he was like, I can't do this, this will lead to trouble, I can't do this. And he just left. And I was like, okay, so I need to find someone else. And then I found the vice president of Erdogan's party, a woman who's very good on Twitter and who really likes to talk to the press. And she told me how she gave an interview to the Economist a few months ago, and it took on for like 3 hours. And then in the piece, she had just one line, and she was very sad about it. And I was like, this is how the Economist does it. And then she talked to me about how great Erdogan's project is, how democratic Turkey is. And apparently so I met her in the headquarters of the AK Party, the Erdogan's party in Ankara. And apparently there's a room there where they read all the foreign newspapers every day, starting with the New York Times, to look at Turkey's coverage. And if there's something they don't like, they bring it to her. She decides what to do about it. And I was like, I'm glad I'm not writing for the New York Times. And so she told me about growing up in Turkey as a headscarved woman and not being allowed to go to university. And this person, Ravza Kavakçı, her sister was the first Turkish parliamentarian who tried to enter the parliament with a headscarf. And during that time, when the secularists were running the country, lots of men again, and they just protested against her, and they called her a terrorist. They called her a troublemaker, and they started hitting on the tables of the parliament to kick her out. And so this was a kind of trauma for headscarved people in Turkey in the 1990s. And so because this thing happened to her sister, the family moved to the US. And she said it was during the flight to the US that, and I think they flew for business class or something, that for the first time someone treated her in a kind way. And she was very surprised by it because she was wearing the headscarf. And in the US, she said she fell in love with the American system, the kind of religious freedoms in America and everything. And so she went to college there. She became a kind of entrepreneur. And when Erdogan became a politician in the 1990s, and when he became prime minister in 2000s, she decided to return. And all these early founders of Erdogan's party, the AKP, they point to the United States as their inspiration. They say, we want to make Turkey like America, because there they have freedoms. They don't have this horrible French thing called laïcité, They don't deal with these things. There's entrepreneurial freedoms and everything. You can own a gun or whatever, and and so the Turkish Islamists, the thing they hated the most was the kind of the French French culture and the French ways, because they didn't like that. So they wanted to imitate the American system. And they ended up building a presidential system in Turkey since mid-2010s. We have the presidential system. And so Ravza Kavakçı, the person I spoke to in the book, was a big supporter of that system, because she believed that really like a strongman regime in Turkey will make Turkey American. I mean, that's the way of thinking. So the idea is not to turn Turkey into Saudi Arabia or Iran. The idea for them is to turn Turkey into a kind of, maybe we can say Trumpian America, like strongman. You can be rude on the street. You can be an evangelist or whatever. Like with religion, you can do whatever you like, and you can hate the elites and those horrible progressives, however passionately you like. And they ended up building that system, and I'm amazed, to the end point.
I want to get to the state of what that looks like in a second, because even since you wrote this book, a lot has changed. But I want you to explain a little bit your own sort of process, your own evolution on a lot of these issues. You kind of talk about your youth as a Marxist, right? With your comrades trying to wake up the masses, your kind of evolution, your even sort of curiosity or maybe interest in the project Erdogan is building, and then how you kind of become disenchanted with it. So tell me a bit about how you evolved along the way to sort of coming to hate sort of everyone involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, as Marxists, I was a Marxist in high school, and we were trying to get into the hearts of the Turkish working classes. And the Turkish working classes loved religion. Like, that was a fact that you couldn't ignore. And if you went to the working classes with the kind of hyper-secularist, atheist ideas that we had, and the kind of outlook, the kind of garments that we wore, it didn't work, and so we started kind of exploring the working class mentality, let's say, and what it represents. And around the same time, when I was in high school, Erdogan, the young Islamist, he was working with a communist politician who organized his whole scheme when he was running for Istanbul mayor. And he, I think, gave Erdogan the idea that in order to work with the working class, you have to be willing to talk to, sex workers, to imams, to transsexuals, to all kinds of people in Istanbul, and you have to win their hearts. And to do that, you have to take off kind of the mask of the Turkish politician, who is like very uptight and who represents the Turkish secular republic, all that. And so people like me, lots of people around me, I realized they shared this dislike of the Turkish Republic and its kind of nationalist and authoritarian foundations. And so among those, many put their trust in Erdogan's party when he first founded it. And this is now, it looks very strange when we look from today, but during those years, Erdogan said, I'm like making this great coalition against Turkish state officialdom. We are the Turkish people. You can be a communist, you can be a feminist, you can be Kurdish, this and that. As long as you want to kind of reform the Turkish state, you're with me. that was what he was saying. So now looking back from today, I see the dangers of the charismatic politician, because Erdogan really convinced people, even the communists, some communists, that this was what he was going to do. He gained the support of many international politicians, leaders. Even George Soros supported Erdogan early on. And looking at it now, Erdogan calls Soros the red communist, and Soros represents everything that he hates now. But at the time, so many politicians put their trust in Erdogan. So, of course, it was all rhetoric. It was very carefully devised. And now, looking at it now, I think that the alternatives to Erdogan started emerging, as you say, with the last elections in March this year. There were lots of opposition victories in many cities. And once again, we have these charismatic men who are very good on podiums, saying very nice things. They say we are forming a coalition against this figure. And on the one hand, it's a good thing. Maybe we will get rid of this system. But on the other hand, I'm skeptical, because these men, when you give them power, you don't know what they'll do. They always do the bad thing and become. I don't want to like a third front on my galaxy of the bad people.
Well, there's this funny anecdote in the book where you're talking to some Americans. I think you and some colleagues are talking to some Americans in Istanbul, right as Trump, I think, was about to get elected. And somebody recommends this piece of speculative fiction. It could happen here, which is a story about hypothetical America where fascism rises to power.
Yeah.
And you sort of look back and see all the points along the way where this wasn't a given for Turkey, right? There were so many options to do something different. There were so many people who wanted a pluralist, liberal, democratic Turkey, and it just, every step of the way, those hopes sort of get dashed. In the prologue of your book, you talk about your hopes being dashed yet again in last year's elections. So maybe talk to me a bit about that, about why it is it seems like Turkey has all these great opportunities to sort of realize the aspirations of all the regular people and the poets and the filmmakers you talk about, but why you just never seem to get there.
Yeah, I think we lack local democracy, the channels of local democracy. People are lazy about democracy. They just want to put all that democracy represents on the shoulders of one person. They're willing to appoint that person and not exercise it themselves. And then those figures can do anything they like with that power. So that's the main problem. And I was in New York just after Trump became president, and I was touring some publications in Manhattan, and they were basically asking me to the newsroom to give them lectures about the next steps. How did it happen in Turkey? How can we stop Trump? And in the bookshops, the Sinclair Lewis book about America becoming a fascist state, it was a bestseller. But of course, in America, the checks and balances, there were in every step checks and balances. That was what was great about reading about the Trump presidency in the New York Times, like in places like that. How was the system reacting to it? And in Turkey, the system has been co-opted to such a level that it's just like you don't wait for the system to protect you against an autocrat. You're afraid of the system because the autocrat is in every part of the system. so much centralized. And that has been the great problem we had in Turkey since Erdogan built this presidential system. And after the local elections in March, which ended with opposition victories, we saw just this week Erdogan sending his police to different cities and provinces and arresting mayors, accusing them of being terrorists, and appointing placeholders, his own men, as mayors. So yesterday, this beautiful town called Hakkari, and it features in my book as well. It was once an Armenian region, and I visited all these mountains in Hakkari, around Hakkari, and around all these mountains there were monasteries and great churches, and you find these stones that the Armenians left. They're called the hachkars, these stones, and these crosses, and people now there are predominantly Kurdish, and they voted for these Kurdish candidates, and these Kurdish candidates became mayors. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 80% getting that kind of majorities. But when Erdogan decides they're terrorists, they have to go. So I don't know what is in Turkey's future, because this is a kind of colonial mentality. Like, I'm afraid for that mayor that has been sent from Ankara. He's a Turkish colleague of Erdogan's. What do you do when you're sent? It's like very colonial. You're sent there to rule this whole city that doesn't want you. So these things make us very pessimistic. And like, after the elections, all my friends who are living in New York, in Toronto, like who have been exiled because of the system in Turkey, they were very cheerful. They were like, "Oh, maybe we should come back. Can we arrange something in this university? Can I get a curatorship here? Or And then when you get some news like that, you're like, no, this was just fake hope.
That fake hope, I think, comes up a lot. And one of the points in the book where you kind of raise that hope is around a promise that Erdogan made to start a peace process with the Kurds, right? And if anybody kind of follows Turkey at all, I think one of the things they know is that there's been this long bubbling dispute between the Turks and the Kurds who want independence. And that hope kind of goes nowhere yet again. And the Kurds, as you're explaining, become these villains. Talk to me a bit about the kind of rhetorical or imagined role that the Kurds play in Erdogan's political project, and how it impacts people's kind of quest for security and for safety.
Yeah, so the Kurds were not allowed to speak their own languages for many decades, and they have been harassed by the government constantly throughout the Republican history, and especially in the 1980s, just after the military coup on September 12th, 1980, they suffered the most horrible torture in eastern prisons of Turkey. And they were the initial backers of Erdogan. They really supported Erdogan because Erdogan said, "I'm going to destroy that system that tortured you." That was so Turkish nationalist. And Erdogan said, "I'm going to destroy Turkish nationalism. I'm going to bring peace and religious harmony." And most of the Kurds living in Turkey are very religious and Muslim. And so there's a commonality between Erdogan's movement and the Kurdish movement. But at the same time, another part of the Kurdish movement is very secularist and very communist and is very anti-Islam, let's say. And this is the militancy of the Kurdish movement, who are not defined by the values of religion and Islam. So Kurds helped Erdogan become prime minister. They voted for him very dominantly in many cities. And then Erdogan said, I'm going to solve the Kurdish question. I'm going to give you some partial autonomy, some more local rights and everything. And then they were coming close to an agreement. And then some Kurds realized that this agreement was a kind of Faustian pact. Like, if Kurds wanted to be free, they had to allow Erdogan to become an all-powerful president. Because Erdogan was envisaging this presidential system in 2010s when the Kurdish negotiations were happening. So he gave them this offer, make me a super powerful president and I'll give you local rights. And of course, some Kurds said, okay, but others didn't. And some people in the Kurdish movement leaked the documents that contained these discussions to the Turkish press. And this Turkish newspaper called Milliyet published the leaks. And that created such a furore that, in 2010, that was the biggest thing. And the Kurds were right. They could have gotten their autonomous rights and everything, but Erdogan would have become this figure maybe much sooner than he did. And so this is all about making these kind of calculations. I give you this, you give me that. I give you a little bit freedom, you give me a little bit authoritarian power, this and that. It's very Trumpian, really.
Speaking of, whether it's Trump, whether it's Viktor Orban, whether it's Vladimir Putin, the role of conspiracy theories and this sort of imagined other and this deep state becomes this trend across a bunch of illiberal leaders around the world. But Erdogan maybe even came up or perfected it even before a lot of them did. So tell me a bit about Fethullah Gulen and the role that this Gulenist movement, which probably does not ring a lot of bells here, plays in Turkey.
Yeah, so when Erdogan first got power, he found himself lacking of personnel, like who will run these different departments, because most of the Islamists didn't have a good education, didn't have the same skills with the secularists, and they hated the secularists, and they didn't want them anywhere near power, so they were looking for some good recruitments, and then the Gulenists came. So the Gulenist movement is basically a part of Islam that is called the Naqshbandi, and it's a lodge, an Islamic lodge, led by different leaders throughout the history, and it's a kind of Sufi Islamic lodge, but this particular wing is very business friendly and is very confident on its feet, and is very American educated, and is very good at networking. And so the Gulenists, as they came to be known, were appointed to key positions in ministries, in the police force, in media, and for many people they were dangerous because this was a kind of cult led by a leader who continues to live in Pennsylvania, in the U.S., in the mountains, and as I say about Erdogan and all those male leaders, he shares the same qualities. He's the man on top. Whatever he does, people, imitate him. So this Gulen guy was really supporting Erdogan, and during the elections, he said to his believers, wake up even the dead so that they should vote for Erdogan. So that was his order, and people followed his order. But after a while, Erdogan started getting paranoid about Gulen because he's in the US and whether he could get him away from power. And so this led to a very dirty fight between two men, one in the US, one in Turkey, and then to a coup attempt, which, like, you didn't want to be in Istanbul during the coup attempt because there were fighter jets flying above you and breaking the windows, and tanks on the street, really. And you couldn't understand what was going on, like a policeman firing at a soldier, and a soldier throwing a bomb to a policeman, like, who is who, what is going on, I hate this country, I hate everything, and you didn't want to live there. And so this failed coup led to the purge of all the Gulenists in the country, and we understood that the state apparatus was Gulenists. You know, all the key people in the ministries, in the police, everywhere were Gulenists. And now they're replaced by Erdoganists, who are similarly following this leader, another leader, but a leader nonetheless. So this society is built on this kind of blind devotion to the person who's leading your group. And that's the problem with Turkey, and that continues, unfortunately.
I have one more question for you, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. We barely even touched on the coup, so there's lots of questions for you. So start thinking about them now, and the mic will go around in a second. But the last question I have for you is about you yourself. I mean, in the book, you talk about the risk to those who speak the truth. You talk about the censorship and the surveillance that's pervasive in Turkey. I mean, you know, there's even a fear that the state is interrupting movies midway through if they're uncharitable to the state. TV broadcasts get cut off if people start speaking criticism on stage. What risk is present to you? I mean, you're still in Istanbul. This book is not charitable to really anybody, you know, in running things in the country. What risk is present to you and others like you as you keep kind of speaking truth to power, as it were?
Yeah, so there's some pockets of freedom in Turkey. For example, the novelists and the poets and the essayists who work with the book format, because Erdogan people, they don't read books. And
I never do.
Yeah, if you're a columnist, you know, you're on their desk every morning. But if you're in the book, you're on the shelf. You're gathering dust. And also, I met so many people in Turkey who told me, "Do you live in Turkey? I didn't know you lived in Turkey." And they just assumed I wasn't living in Turkey because I could write books and, you know, just be free. I was like, "Yeah, dude, I'm in Turkey." And but nowadays, I think I see lots of people testing the freedom. Like, the opposition wins in the local elections. You know, Erdogan is maybe on his last legs and everything. So, do we have the freedom now? So people are like testing it slowly, whether on social media or in newspaper columns. So far, no, not free yet. You still get into trouble. But for people like Orhan Pamuk, for example, you know, they have more, I think, freedoms of the fiction. And also the freedoms of long-form reporting, and these men who run Turkey, they have no time for books and everything. They just even newspaper columns, they're just addicted to Twitter, and I mean, if you go after them, you surely get into trouble. But if you kind of offer a thoughtful analysis of the system they've been building for many years, you know, they don't have the patience. So my biggest lack is their lack of patience and curiosity and reading skills. I can go on.